as people get busy in midlife, whether they're coaches, athletes, again, people working 9 to 5s, those friend circles get tougher to connect with because just time and things like that. And so, as you mentioned, when we're making sort of new friends, and you see this with a lot of my male clients,
Mhm.
especially again, the sort of higher achievers or see themselves in that way, that idea of even taking that first step to show vulnerability is a long way down the list. I mean, to your point, they sort of default to, whether consciously or unconsciously, to talking about achievements or whatnot.
Yeah.
Is there sort of a first step or a way, an entry point into starting this sort of process for people who really is almost a 180 for them in terms of how they would operate?
No, it's a real issue. And there is some insight into how to handle this from organizational behavior. Truth is, it's like there's what's called the beautiful mess effect, which is that we're always terrified that if somebody knows we have a weakness, if somebody knows we're struggling with something, that they're not going to like us, so they're going to reject us. And the truth is, that's all going on in our head. But when you flip it, usually when somebody reveals a difficulty, something they're struggling with, we don't usually oh, I gotta get away from this guy. Like that's not how we usually react. We usually, are sympathetic. We usually go, oh, that's not a big deal. But when it's us, we feel like it's a higher bar. But in organizational behavior, and for leaders, and this would certainly apply to coaches as well, a good safe way to start down the path to vulnerability is, rather than opening up and saying, I'm going to be vulnerable, I'm a terrible coach, that would not be a great idea, but you can reveal some vulnerability, some weakness in an area that's separate, that's unrelated. It's like for a coach to be awesome at their job, to be really good at working with athletes, and to say, hey, it's like being a good dad has, been difficult for me. That doesn't threaten their ability to do their job, their prestige in terms of their profession, their ability to work with athletes. That's something where people can relate to that. People can understand that. You're opening up, but you're not in any way reducing your status or ability in people's eyes as a coach.
Great advice, and it's amazing how, obviously, like everything else, it takes repetition and engaging in the process, because it is that connection, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Community connection, loneliness, these are real issues in terms of health and wellness. Staying on the coaches for a minute, I was writing about NFL coaches and the rise in terms of, well, coaches in any sport really. NBA, we see it as well. Whether it's Tyronn Lue, Steve Clifford, struggling with lack of sleep and struggling with hypertension and prediabetes, and really taking a toll physically. And you write about in your book that there's pretty much two things that we can that will predict whether or not you'll be alive 1 year after you have a heart attack, which might surprise people.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's Robin Dunbar, who's famous for creating the Dunbar number, which is basically how our circles of friendship are like the size of the circles are eerily similar. That human beings are like wired for that. He did that research, and basically, when it came to recovering from a heart attack, the two things were don't smoke and do you have good friendships. And, obviously, other stuff matters, but he was like the delta between those two and everything else was enormous. And you see this in the data come up again and again. If you look at women who are recovering from breast cancer surgery, how well they did, oddly enough, totally uncorrelated with whether they had a spouse. It was number of close friends. Men recovering from a heart attack, again, spouse didn't matter. It was, close friends. There's a study out of UC Berkeley that basically said, in terms of health and longevity, relationships were second only to genetics in terms of health and longevity prediction. Obviously, those other things matter, but our relationships are so critical. We forget. We kind of take it for granted. And in terms of the happiness aspect, there's an economic study that basically having solid relationships was the equivalent of making an extra $131,000 a year, which that's try asking your boss for a $131,000 raise and see how well that goes over. There's other things. We forget about it. We kind of take it for granted. We forget because there's been an explosion of social science research into happiness, over the past decade or so. And the mistake we make, Brett Ford, she's a researcher at UC Berkeley. She said that one of the biggest mistakes we make is we think about being happier and we say, what can I do? What do I have to accomplish? What do I need to get? And the truth is, we need to turn the lens and stop thinking about me do, me get, and think about our relationships, because so much of it comes from that. If we're not considering other people, our health, our happiness, those methods are going to fail because how the people around us are so integral to success in that arena.
Yeah, alcohol is an interesting one. Going back to the start of the conversation there, when we look at all these studies, whether alcohol is good for us or bad for us, and these days we could say, well, it's tough to say whether alcohol is really good for you. There are potentially some benefits. The benefits that we do see, however, typically come because they can't really tease out. If we do see benefit, it's the fact that you're having a drink with friends and you're laughing, and you're telling stories and everything else. So I always find it interesting on the medical intakes. If you sort of have a few questions about alcohol, and all the ones below the line that are really important all revolve around drinking by yourself at home, that becomes the red light for the docs and the medical staff to say, I think we might have an issue here.
Oh no, I mean that's the other thing. Obviously, smoking is terrible for you. But what is interesting is, when you chop up the data enough, for most people who smoke, smoking is not a social activity. So you don't have to tease that out like with alcohol. So smoking, it's obviously just bad. With alcohol, you get those weird blips in the data because so much of drinking, is done socially that, it's like, hey, it's like, yes, there's some health negatives, but if it's spending your time with friends, we're gonna need some better statistics in here.
Yeah, especially when we look at those European countries, because it is more around sitting around the table and chatting. Whereas, in North America and the UK, we've turned it into a sport more than anything else in terms of getting through it. But if we pivot here a little bit and talk, rather than the coaches, the younger athletes, it's interesting now in the NBA, even we've got young athletes, and there's a growing concern over mental health and loneliness and some aspects of anxiety that you'd think, hey, this young athlete's achieved their lifelong goal. You'd think they'd be on top of the world. And, today's society, obviously, we're supposed to be more connected than ever. We've got social media, but increasingly, we're feeling disconnected. You touch on this a lot in the new book. Can you share a few insights with us?
Yeah, I mean, what I found that just blew me away was that basically John Cacioppo was a neuroscientist. He did a lot of research on loneliness, and what he found is that on average, lonely people don't spend any less time with other people than non-lonely people do, which is kind of mind-blowing. But once you think about, lonely in a crowd, we've all felt lonely in a crowd. So what's going on there? If lonely people don't spend less time with people, if you can feel lonely in a crowd, what's going on here? And that's what you realize when you study loneliness, because when we look at the history of loneliness, there was a historian out of the University of York, and basically, Faye Alberghetti. And what she found was that basically, if you look before the 19th century, the word lonely is used in texts, but it doesn't mean like sad and depressed. Literally, the book Frankenstein, the original, is the first book. And then, to use the word lonely as a negative, usually lonely, it meant isolated, but it didn't. And loneliness was almost never discussed. You heard discussions of solitude, which is a positive. So how does all this come together? The issue is that loneliness is a subjective feeling. It's something we feel inside of us. You can have solitude, nobody's around, but you feel good. You can have loneliness, but you can be lonely in a crowd. So what's going on? What's going on is loneliness is how you feel about your relationships. If you feel like, hey, I'm apart from people, but they love me, they care about me, I'm part of a group, I'm part of a religious community, I'm part of a team, then you don't have to feel lonely. And by the same token, if you don't feel part of a group, if you're not part of a religious community, if you're not part of a team, if you don't feel like you have good relationships, you can be lonely in a crowd. because loneliness is a subjective feeling. It's how you feel about your relationships. And before the 19th century, most people were embedded in local communities. People couldn't live on their own. People were part of religious traditions much more than they are today. There was, often strong, for better or for worse, there was strong nationalism. There were communities. People needed to work together. So even if you were apart physically from people, you still knew that I was a member of this unit. I was a member. I was a contributing part. We don't have that feeling as much today. Community is broken down. It's like religious experience is broken down. We don't have that feeling. So when we're apart from people, we really feel like, is anybody there? And the effects of loneliness on the brain are dramatic. I mean, loneliness basically increases, like every negative health metric goes up. But the amount of stress that it causes to the brain, Cacioppo found, was basically the equivalent of a physical assault. So like feeling lonely is the stress equivalent of getting punched in the face.